watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 191, A Beard, an App, and a Blender, Building Better Apps. Okay, before we get into the show, another shout out to MW Lug, if that's going to be taking place on August 17th, 2016. So if you're watching this show prior to that date, I highly recommend you go. It's a great user group conference. It's well run. There's a lot of great material in there. A lot of expert speakers. Plus me. It looks like I'm going to be speaking this year. Again, and that's always a fun thing to do. So if you're going to be available and you're interested in the X pages or the space, I highly recommend you check it out and say hi and visit. And it's in Austin. And Austin's like the barbecue capital of the world, so it's just gonna be a great venue. It's also very affordable. Most of it's paid for by sponsors. I think there's like a token $60, $70 registration fee. I forget what it is or so. But if you're interested in this space, this is probably where you want to be to try to learn some material and network and kind of catch up if need be, or meet and share and even have a beer. So check that out and give that some thought. Okay, in this show, Eric McCormick returns, and he's just the great developer, and that's enough said about there. But he's also an IBM champion. He's got his fingers in so many different pots in development. It's not just X pages or so. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But he's like me. He's a customer, So that's always nice to see someone who's just out there sharing what they know and what they use in their day job life. He's on Twitter. He's on web. He's on the blog and stuff like that. So he's available. He's got a lot of code out there on GitHub, different examples. He's done a lot of posts on servlets and a lot of examples on Game of Thrones. So if you like Game of Thrones, you might want to look at his stuff just to play with the examples and sample databases that he puts out. Okay, let's talk about this show for a minute. I really don't know how to describe it. It's really outside the X Pages box, which is where I want to go, and we're going to get a lot more of these shows on NotesIn9. This is a great, I think, overview of some of the different tools that are out there. He's touching on AngularJS and this Yeoman and a lot of other things. So this is stuff that's outside the X Pages world that you really need to start paying attention to, and then I include myself in that. So again, we're going to be doing a lot more of these shows, I hope, on NotesIn9, and there's no one better right now to kind of take us down that path than Eric. So with that being said, let's go to the demo.
I'm Eric McCormick, and I'm back to NotesIn9 with a video on a high overview of some of the topics that I included in my Connect session in February in Orlando this year. This will be a high-level overview with some specifics. Will be slightly breezed over. If you have any questions, by all means follow up with myself or anyone in the community that knows about such things. I'm always more than happy to talk about such things because, as the session talks about, application structure is big on my mind. Building better apps that are more easily developed that are more easily maintained, and just generally make more sense is always something on my mind. My company has a fair amount of distributed variety of offices and field offices. So for us, we have to make things actually work relatively well just to play with the varying different types of connections that we have. So bear with me here. I blog a fair amount, and I also post most of my code out on GitHub. So when I give my session the morning after, I posted to my blog with a link to the repository and also a video showing the entirety of the demo that it fizzled slightly during the actual session, but that's what I get for trying to cram a couple of demos worth into all in one shot. Now, I still think we covered a lot of great material in the session. Real happy about that. But long story short, I'm covering it now so that I can better demonstrate what I was talking about. If you're looking to reference any of the slides from my session, they're in my GitHub repository, and I'm on github.com/edmoose. Don't ask, long story. It's stuck. It's short. Short is good for me, and Beard App Blender is the path. My blog is edmoose.io. and I hope you enjoy what I have to show. I know some of you are probably wondering what on earth you would use this for. Now, Generator Angular helps scaffold out an Angular application using the AngularJS framework. I happen to be a fan of it. I'm going to use my demo in it. Don't worry too much about that. Ultimately, it's only relating to the front-end aspects of your web application. So the front-end components and the type of application I'm going to demonstrate is going to be a server-agnostic web application in the front end that happens to run in a Domino NSF container with the XPages application runtime to provide the back-end logic for our interfacing via a RESTful API servlet. That's not the focus, but that segregation of back-end and front-end, which causes us to write our code for the back-end and expose it only in such a way that the front-end is a very consistent approach, means that the agnosticism inherent to having that kind of separation means that we can reap the benefit of a lot of this modern front-end tooling. So I will be focusing on showing how this works. Now, you can see here in my terminal, I've got a project folder, which contains a folder called on this project. Now, I've pulled that up in Sublime Text here, just for reference on the projects tree. The project tree shows that I have my high-level project folder, and for those of you wondering, think of this as being the main folder level at which you create a Git or Mercurial repository. And then inside of that is where we keep our OnDisk project and other assets. All this other stuff, just think of it as other stuff for now. So we have this OnDisk project, and in it is a very common looking set of things. And that directly maps to my VM with Designer. It's imported as an OnDisk project, and it is syncing with my NSF. Now, yes, I'm in a VM. I'm going to be using my terminal, not in my VM. The file system is linked. Don't get tripped up by that. Normally, especially if you're on a Windows host anyway, I'd recommend using your command line, probably git bash or something like that. More advanced if you're willing to tolerate that, but most people understand git. The git bash does some handling of the command line that's kind of nice, and long story short, is what I prefer to use on Windows. So I'll be using it out here, but it's okay. It's really interacting with what this NSF is. So as you can see, I have two XPages here, index and API, and then outside of it, you can see I have index and API, and of course the metadata files. Matches up, it's the same one. If you still don't trust me, well, I'm sorry, but it really is. So, I mentioned that we'll be using this to help scaffold out a back-end agnostic modern web app, purely the front-end components. So, for those of us that normally do XPages development, you're probably wondering where you can put a file on a Domino server in an NSF specifically that is a general web server context, and the answer is web content. So I'm not going to get into any of the public access concerns or anything. I'm just going to assume that you can figure that out, and if not, there's plenty of stuff out there. In this instance, I usually assume for this sort of a thing that they can see the page, but if they can't interact with the data service because they're not authenticated per the ACL, then they won't be able to even edit, let alone save anything. Now, obviously there are different implementations. By all means, use what's right for you. There are plenty of other people out there that have done such a thing. You can find literature. I know Stephen Whistle and a couple others have talked about setting public access for the web content folder. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt. I'm not going to get into any of the further advanced scenarios of, say, merging together an upstream of a Domino server with an Nginx static asset thing. It's great for performance, but mind-boggling the first time you do it, so not in the scope of this. So, in my OnDisk project, in my web content folder, aside from the web inf folder, which we'll need to go around later on with the initial setup, everything in here is just normal web assets. So at the NSF level /index.html, I'm going to get what this app is. And it happens to be in an NSF that has access to what I expose as far as back-end components, such as an API.xsp. That one in particular happens to use an XE-REST service. It was an example for this demo, and don't worry too much about that because that's not what it's about. It's about the front end specifically. So, the web content directory is going to be where we generate our built assets to. Our source files that we use are actually going to be kept up in this one here called app. Now this is the source files, like I said. You can see they have some custom annotations and stuff that Yeoman uses with their grunt file to do custom things such as adding in a vendor CSS, that sort of a thing. And there are specific rules for it, but it does optimizations of your vendor files, of your app code, all that kind of stuff, so that when you build out to web content, like my Task Runner series talked about considerably, you get an optimized version of the application, the web app. That way you are decreasing number of, say, network requests against different assets. Your 5 different CSS files are now optimized in only one. So there's a lot of great potential here and promise to help make better web apps. So we'll work out of the app source at the high level. We'll run the command that corresponds, we'll get there, and that will generate the built version or the dist version, which actually is going to be pointed to the ODP web content directory. Once it hits there, the sync from the OnDist project will occur to the NSF. The NSF will have the built version, and only the built version, because it only syncs with the OnDist project. All right, so previously on my blog, I did a short series on task runners. You don't need to know the material from that to be able to watch this and still get something out of it. There is some intersection if you look to do some more customizing of what I'm going to demonstrate. However, you can take this all as its own show, and you should be able to use it and work with it just fine. The one config change that has to be made, I will show you how to do. The series I did covered Grunt and Gulp, 2 very popular task runners, which are available within the Node.js runtime. They're provided, or at least available, in the NPM package registry. So you don't need to know Node to use them. You don't need to know the tools individually so much to use what I'm going to demonstrate. And in fact, after the initial config, you really don't need to do a whole lot with these tools except to use them for their intended purpose. And I'll get there in a second. If you're looking to reference any specifics, I outline a few back here, but it's certainly not needed, like I said. I'm going to talk primarily about this tool called Yeoman. Yeoman is a tool for scaffolding web applications. Now, they use the term modern web applications. That's generally true. They only have generators, or what they're called, to build according to a certain rule set for the ones that they have available. They do, however, have quite a lot. To get started up, you need Node and NPM. NPM comes with Node if you install from nodejs.org. And then you install their tool, npm install globally yo, as they showed on the main page right here. There's also some other packages such as Bower, Grunt, etc. that are needed. And I'll get there when it comes time to do any install. But they also have some simple or simplified examples on their Getting Started page that walk you through some of the basics of using one in the first place. Now, if you're asking yourself, what is an application scaffolding tool, then think for a moment about any application you've started new from scratch and had to do a lot of setup. Folder structure, layout of the application, configuration files, all the little nitty-gritty stuff that you really don't want to spend your time doing, because then you're doing more time configuring than you are writing code. So this is a tool that helps automate some of this according to certain rules, and those rules are defined in their generators. So you can see they have one here, and this is the one I'll be using, generator Angular, which is published out there on GitHub and in NPM. So npm install here are all the dependencies it needs, and after you install those, you're able to use it. If you're going to use Compass, which is Ruby dependent, you also have to have that gem. I'm not going to. Ignore that. Make your project directory, change it directory into it, invoke yo, the main application scaffolding command line command, Angular to specify generator dash Angular, this one, and then the app name. And then it will prompt you through a number of different questions about how to get set up. Once that's so, it will give you a boilerplate application, and then you have the ability to invoke the main application, this first one, which is the name of the actual generator, or you can do a colon and then the subgenerator. Subgenerators are essentially templated file system changes. So say you have the controller that comes out of the box for your boilerplate app, and you want to add another one per Angular. And you don't need to know Angular for this example either. Invoking yo Angular colon controller and passing it a name will create a new one in the correct file location and then hook it in accordingly. The one I'm a big fan of is this angular.route or Angular route, which establishes the new HTML partial, the new controller for that corresponding route, and then hooks it in the appropriate place for the controllers. So you've just automated some of your steps that you would have to go do manually all the time. So that's pretty handy in my opinion. And that's the promise of task runners and, more importantly, scaffolding tools. Generator Angular is one of many generators, as you saw, that you could use. They have one out there for quite a lot. Yeoman's gotten fairly robust to the point that if you could think of a modern web framework tooling, chances are there is a generator for it. And if you look and notice these little mustaches next to them, then you can see that that is an officially sponsored Yeoman team maintained package. So if you want, you could, for instance, use generator Chrome extension to develop a Chrome extension. I've never written one. A tool like this might help me get in the door a little bit more easily. While this may seem a bit daunting and possibly complex to a lot of people, I'd like to take the moment to highlight the fact that in the project tree, you're already keeping your Git or Mercurial tracking outside of your OnDis project anyway, in a higher level folder. And anything such as like a Java doc to your application, other documentation, or other project or build assets are probably going to be alongside of, not in your OnDis project. So while this may look a little bit messy the first time you're in here, it's not. Now, a couple of things that Yeoman is using with Generator Angular is Bower to help manage dependencies. Don't worry about what mine are, just that they have them. It's also using Grunt to conduct a lot of the actual horsepower behind what it's doing. And the biggest difference that's a single config change that we have to make here is, remember the web in folder that's inside of web content? We need to make sure we don't clobber that and take that out of our NSF or our OnDis project, which syncs with our NSF whenever it does a build. So there's a clean task, and the dist rules of the files of the source as this. I copied this off of just like .git, and in my case it's just copy the line, and all we're doing is telling it to not nuke the webint folder, and it happens to be matching by regex literal here. That will guarantee that when we run the clean task as part of the new build, that the webint folder will not be touched. And that has a couple important files, such as faces config and xsp.properties. We want those. We need those. It takes breaking your application once to have it truly ingrained in your mind so that you never do it again. Don't worry, I've made that mistake for you. So please learn from my experience. On the whole, I'd also just recommend that if you can, you install and use Cameron Gregor's Swiper plugin for Domino Designer so that you're not constantly syncing back and forth the overhead that's not really required for some of the metadata with the design elements. So, with that said, let's get started. Now that we're ready, I've gone ahead and run the grunt clean task, and all that really means is I've cleared out my web content directory except for my webinf folder. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually copy my app source so I don't lose my work, which isn't a whole lot, out to another location. So this means that I can basically, I'm going to get rid of everything so we have a clean slate. So as you can see, I've left known modules, which my git ignores. And all that means is that when I do my npm install, it should go a little bit faster. As you can see, pretty empty. Again, the Ondisk project already lost everything from web content, so I'm going to do yo Angular. So, Yeoman likes to introduce itself quite nicely. It also mentions that there's experimental gulp usage instead of grunt. I'm going to say no. Sass with compass, I'm going to say no. Bootstrap, yes. And personally, I happen to like ng messages, so I'm going to include that. And yes, I'm going to overwrite the package.json. And away she goes. Yeah. Once it's complete, it'll drop you back out to where your command line last was. And as you can see, I have all the other stuff now. I have not just my Ondisk project, but I have a grunt file, a readme, which contains basically a do something with me, bower.json, which contains the breakout of front-end libraries. There are other ways to use front-end library dependency management. I happen to like Bower. It uses Bower. I roll with it. You don't have to know how to use it if you answer the questions correctly. It even includes a test folder in which the test scripts are contained. So if I do this, you can see that the spec folder inside of that contains tests for each of the two controllers that it just scaffolded out. So it scaffolded out into the app directory. I have the corresponding about and main view. I have the corresponding styles. And here this corresponding main app script and two controller scripts. So they have some boilerplate information as well, but at least they have some. And these scripts, while boilerplate, do actually create some sort of a test. Now, it should be noted that the boilerplate is testing correctly, so the assertion of it should attach a list of awesome things to the scope. It checks for the things in the controller. So if you're looking at the about test, it's expecting this list that it's creating in memory to be length 3. Well, the one they created is length 3. As soon as you change anything, like removing that, it's not boilerplate anymore, and the test will fail. It's its way of prompting you to create your own tests. You can comment the lines out, but that kind of defeats the purpose of having tests, but there it is. So now we have an app folder in our main project directory, and we need to tell this where to go and add back in that line about where to go to not clobber our webinf folder. So if I find the clean and I paste that in there, comma separated, save, there's that. Now the clean will no longer nuke my webinf folder. Also, by default, it generates out to the dist path. So up here at the same level would be a dist. That's the built or distributable version. That's not what I'm going to use, though. I'm going to use odp web content. That's all the config I have to do to make this work now. So if I type in grunt, it'll perform the build. I'll pull up my VM so you can see as it comes in. It'll kick off the task to import from the Ondisk project. It's working through some temp folder magic to create the vendor and scripts JavaScript files. And as you can see, it's updating. cdnify is running. A lot of these are specific tasks in the grunt file that it's just highlighting as we do things. Once it's done, this gives you a nice little breakdown of how long each subtask took to execute, which long term, as you're building things, can be handy to identify a problem. So as you can see, the sync task occurred, and even with my funny setup with a file system both on my host macOS and also my guest VM Windows file system, it managed to pick up the changes and build out accordingly. So now that that's there, build automatically is turned on, so I should be able to come in here and say, oh, hello. As you can see, got a couple of boiler routes. Not everything's working, so the out-of-the-box does not include working state changes based on the ng route state. So ng router is handling the hash route of about. I'm seeing the about view. It didn't change the style because it's a simplified boilerplate. So there are some things you'll have to do. If you get used to this over time, eventually you realize what it is you have to do. But so contact here is doing nothing. Now, you saw how I did that. I'm going to create a new route and show you what that looks like. So yo, Angular, just like it talks about route. I'm going to add beers. So what this is doing is it's creating the new generation of files based on what we told it to do as far as the subgenerator. It's creating a new HTML partial that it will use for the hash/beers, and it created the files accordingly. So in app, in views, we now see beers. In scripts, we now see controllers beers. So to get the changes to come across, once again, we run grunt, which does its build. And you can set it up with a watch task. In fact, if I do that, grunt serve, it runs all the same things, but it sits there and listens instead of exiting. And it's got its own local preview port, but that won't be running from the Domino context. So I'm going to kill that. So it's running watch. It's also running a web server that I'm not using. You could pull this back out or not, your preference. But it's running watch. What watch means is it will watch for save events on certain files. So say I make a change to index.html, next thing you know, it's updating its build execution requirements based on that. Pretty handy. It also means that you're only limited now to as fast as you can handle your sync back into Domino. I've heard that Domino Next will include improvements with some of the on-disk project handling. I certainly am hopeful for the most optimal experience from this standpoint because obviously it's powerful. So now that we have that, we have our application running and working here, and I can go ahead and make a couple quick changes to my app. So instead of contact beers, running watch, it saw the change. My navigation routes will now update after they get pulled in. And you can prompt that sometimes by doing a quick little refresh on the on-disk project. No, Control R. Okay. Now, in my task runner series, I noticed that sometimes Domino Designer, especially in my kind of configuration, doesn't always pick up immediately on a change to a file that doesn't have a file change or deletion event. So sometimes it's so quick that it might not pick up on it. So I was editing the index.html. After the first couple of setup things, it's not normally something that I actually have to update very much. I usually wind up having to update some of the specific JS files, the HTML partials. And the build event goes through its build optimization cycle to do a little bit more. But with the index.html, it doesn't have to do very, very much because, as you can see, it's almost identical to what you're going to find anyway. So that's why I wound up killing the watch process to let it do its thing all over from scratch again. And as you can see, it pulled in changes. So now when I refresh here, I have beers as an available route. So here's the home page. Here are the 3 things that come with the boilerplate: about and beers. Part of its scaffolding includes at least identifying where it is. So the only question left now is, what do I want to put in my fancy front-end app to my Domino backend? And as you can see, this can get all kinds of fun. Now that I've shown the entire life cycle, to summarize, I have copied in a previous version of my app directory, which contains the source that I had built up a little bit, but I'm not going to bore you with the changes because they're all just front-end code changes, irrelevant to the actual tooling discussion. So, to summarize, we make our changes in the source or app directory. We run the grunt command or grunt serve to build out the optimized distributable version of the web application. It gets put into the web content directory of our NSF and gets served out from there as native web assets, which is exactly what they are. Our dependencies are managed for us. Our test scripts are created by default for us. All we have to do is fill them out as we go. So, that being said, long story short, I think we have a pretty neat way of building applications that we may not have thought of before. Thanks for watching.
And that's the demo. I really thank Eric for coming on. I know I sat on the show for a little longer than I tried to, so I'm glad to have gotten it out. If you have any information or any questions for me or information, I'd like those too. Here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.